I've just spoken to Mark Jenkin, the BAFTA winning director of the film Bait. We talked about everything from my films to his films. He gives some really great, useful, and entertaining advice. I hope you enjoy it.
BAFTA goes to Mark Jenkin, Kate Byers, Lynn Waite for Bait.
I'm very lucky to be joined with Mark Jenkin, who's the BAFTA winning director of Bait. Mark, thank you so much for joining me. So I saw Bait after my brother had recommended it several times, and he said it's really special. This is something you need to see. There are not many films like this nowadays, and I saw it and I was just amazed.
Why don't you just go back working with Stephen for a bit?
I got bloody principles.
I'm going to have to ask you again not to leave your truck outside. What are you doing, Martin?
It's between me and the clamping company.
But in terms of the conversation we're going to have, I want to start quite early on. So, you know Solly Bowden?
Yeah.
He's a friend of mine, and he recommended Golden Burn, because I know you've been putting like your older films up online. And so I watched Golden Burn. I mean, the word for it would be inspiring, because I'm a low budget filmmaker myself, and a film made by, like, you're quite young at the time. Mm-hmm. And so a film made by quite young people was just really inspiring, especially one that was so good. I think it was quite clear by watching that you didn't need a giant budget or anything. I looked online to find some more details about Golden Burn, but it was quite hard to find. Was it a student film or something, or was it to do with Falmouth University or anything?
No, it was pre-Falmouth University. I'd studied in Bournemouth and done a production degree at the university in Bournemouth, and then I'd gone to London, and then it came out of just being homesick. Really, I wanted to move back to Cornwall. Really, as soon as I got to London, I wanted to be back in Cornwall. So, as a sort of catharsis, I wrote this screenplay, Golden Burn, and then took 2 weeks holiday from where I was working in London, and went home and shot it with my friends who I hadn't really written it about them, because I shot it with a couple of my very old friends and a couple of friends from university who weren't from where I was from. But it was certainly about my experience growing up, and like I say, it was a bit of a catharsis in terms of wanting to be back in Cornwall. And it was a tiny budget. It did still cost money, because at the time the mini DV camera format had just come out, and the cameras were still expensive, so I had to hire a mini DV camera, which sounds crazy now, but I spent, I don't know, probably £1,000, a couple of £1,000 hiring a mini DV camera for a couple of weeks, which we all thought was just this most incredible machine, you know, and you can buy them for pennies now, but at the time it did seem to be. I was very lucky that it was the beginning of that digital revolution where you could shoot digitally on video, and I really liked the look of it, so I was really lucky in that way.
Definitely,
I mean, it's 20 years ago now, so there's not a lot of information. It was sort of pre-internet, I suppose. Well, not pre-internet, but
early stages.
And but actually, while I was shooting Golden Burn, that's when I wrote the original version of Bait. In fact, the producer I work with now, who I didn't know when I made Golden Burn, but the first time he saw Bait, saw the final cut of Bait. He's an associate producer on it. He said Bait is feels like the sequel to Golden Burn.
I think that's very true. They have very similar theming, obviously slightly different tones, and in that obviously shows versatility. In terms of the fact that you made it with your friends and stuff, that's especially what I find inspiring. I'm obviously at a very low level in terms of filmmaking and stuff, but a lot of my films star my own friends and stuff, and I think people undervalue that side of it. Like, I think it just really
don't say low level, just say you're at the beginning.
At the beginning, well, that's what I wanted to talk about.
Which is a really good place to be at.
That's what I wanted to talk about, because how do you go from making a film? I know Bait had a lot of friends and family in it as well, but how do you go from Golden Burn to Bait? Not that they're both not fantastic, but in terms of the like the widespread acclaim and the terms of the fact that just Bait really got out there and it really like hailed you as sort of the next big thing.
Well, there was no plan. It was just that's the way it happened, and I think the success of Bait is just a byproduct of just sticking at doing what I wanted to do. And it's not, I'm not trying to sound like a martyr that I just, worked hard and got to this point. It was just, I've always done what I wanted to do, which was to make films in a very specific way. And through luck rather than judgment, I think Bait hit at a time where people were maybe not looking for a film like that, but certainly open to a film that felt a little bit different and was sort of confrontational in some ways and formally quite uncompromising. But I didn't design it that way. It's just the way I've worked. And as a filmmaker, you'll know it takes a lot of energy and a lot of focus to make films. And I've always been of the opinion that if I'm going to put that much energy in and that much focus, that I've got to enjoy what I'm doing. And most of the time you're only making a film for yourself because there's no audience. Bait has got a large audience now, but when we were making it, it didn't have an audience. We weren't thinking about the audience, wondering what the audience would want, because there was no audience. So we just did the film that we wanted to do. And I think that's how I've got to where I am now, really.
Okay, yeah, that's very encouraging, because I know a lot of people at my level, the beginner level, they feel that they have to make what everyone else wants. And I think the minor success that some of my films have had is that they're not like anything else. Like my style is kind of, you can tell the inspirations, but it's not obviously a rip-off of anything. It is its own thing. And I wanted to ask about when you were making your like first few films, so say when you were like my age, 18 or so, how did you get people to want to watch them? Because I find that the really hard part. How do you start from a very small audience? How do you say, watch my short film? Because most people don't watch short films, especially ones by very young people.
Again, I think I was quite lucky with timing. I think the world's changed now. There's so much content, for want of a better word, such a horrible description of, whereas and I still am making shorts, but when I was trying to get my shorts seen 20 years ago, it was quite easy. I moved back from London to Cornwall, where there was a real strong sort of village hall network of theatre. So theatre companies like Knee High, for example, who would take shows out round the village halls to big audiences. So culturally, that existed. And when short, low budget film production proliferated with the beginning of those lo-fi digital cameras like mini DV and stuff, and people were able to make films for very little money, there was already like a screening network that had been a theatre network that the film movement kind of got hold of and exploited. So there were when I moved back here at the beginning of 2002, there was this network of screenings. And so if you made a short film, you could get it screened, and there were people like down here, there was a group called the Cornwall Media Resource who put on screenings. O Region, who are a film and theatre company who's still going now, who put on a night called Rough Cut, where you could go and take along a short film on tape, and they would show it. So like I said, I think timing was I was very lucky with timing there, and was able to put my films in front of audiences, and also to watch my films with an audience and learn how my films worked in front of an audience. So I think that was again pre-internet, in terms of being able to put films on the internet, because it's not that long ago, really, is it, that we've been able to put full resolution films online and been able to put them in front of an audience. And I think that's meant that there's a huge amount of work out there on the internet, which is very difficult to curate. So yeah, I don't know what the answer to your question is in terms of getting noticed or getting that work seen, but I think that there's certain websites and streaming services that are sort of important in terms of curating work, to pointing out the stuff that somebody is already sort of is vouching for, in a way, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. But that's the thing with it being online. We're not just, say, 20 years ago, me and like my people I make films with, we would have been competing just against our local scene, but now it's the whole world. And in a way, there's a lot of advantages, but in a way, as you said, it oversaturates the market.
Yeah. I mean, festivals are a way to get the work seen, really. My short work started getting noticed when I went back to shooting on film 5 or 6 years ago, and there were festivals like Cork Film Festival and London Short Film Festival. So Don O'Mahony in Cork in Cork at the film festival over there, and Philip Ilson at London Short Film Festival. They were both incredibly supportive of my work, and I just submitted work cold, and it got seen, and they really championed it, and I built up relationships with both of those festivals that mean that they consistently screen my, it's not a foregone conclusion that my work will get screened there, but I've got a relationship with those festivals now, which I've built up through producing more and more work and them screening it. So those festival relationships are really important. But again, that it's a certain amount of luck involved there as well, because the right person has got to happen to see it, and they'll be being overwhelmed with huge amounts of submissions of work. So there's always an element of luck, which is a bit scary, because what if you're unlucky?
Yeah, exactly. In terms of film festivals, I'm surprised how late it took for me and my film groups and guys the camera to start entering our films into festivals. So we've been doing it for about 3 years. I think we're on our 7th or 8th short film at the moment. And it took a while because everyone was saying enter it into film festivals, but I didn't really I didn't see the appeal for a while. And then I entered our most recent one, and we've had about 3 nominations already, which I think is pretty great. So it just shows, I feel like it gives you something to work towards. Online views are great, but what if you can say you've got official selection at somewhere that's thousands of miles away? That is quite a boost.
Yeah, and it is a boost. It's a boost for the work, but it's also a boost for you as a filmmaker, because if somebody else is taking you seriously, then it's a lot easier to take yourself seriously. So and those boosts are so important. Those little moments where somebody, where you see your name in a brochure or on the program on the internet, and you go, right, well, yeah, I'm a film director. It says there, I'm a filmmaker, so I am a filmmaker. I think that's really important.
Yeah, 100%. That's the difference between, I think once you start getting festival recognition, that's the difference between showing your family a film and you're like, oh, this is just you messing about with your mates with a camera. This isn't anything cinematic. And then you get nominated for a festival and it's like, okay, this is maybe something serious now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think I think about it all the time. I've been asked a lot about my work and how I started working, and especially with regard to form and working with film and stuff. And I just always go back to when I was making Super 8 films in the mid-90s in Cornwall, and I was shooting these single rolls of film, editing everything in camera, sending them off to the lab in Germany. They would come back, I'd project them, I'd watch it as I was projecting it, and then make a soundtrack on audio cassette. And I've still got some of the cassettes just over there on the bench, the original cassettes from the mid-90s that still play, And the only person I showed it to was like my mum. And it's really strange because hopefully not full circle, but in February when they won the BAFTA, I looked up and there was my mum, It was really weird that she was
Brilliant.
the one audience member at the outset, and there she was, you know, watching me pick up a BAFTA for Bait, and it's really strange to think that I don't know how that happened, you know.
Sounds so
Again,
satisfying
there's so
for
much
that to
luck.
happen.
Yeah, but there's so much luck. There's so much luck involved, and I think what I'm trying to say is, in a way, I don't feel any different now making films than I did when I was showing them to just my mum, because that was exciting. Because in the mid-90s, I had no idea of the existence of the internet. I didn't know about film festivals. I didn't know about this world outside. So actually making something and finishing something and showing it to just one person felt like such a amazing thing. And even then I thought, this is what I want to do, and success and audience and whatever is just a byproduct of doing the thing that you want to do, and identifying, without meaning to sound like a sort of motivational speaker or anything, but identifying your passion. I feel really lucky that I've found that, because I think some people don't ever work out what really makes them sort of feel satisfied creatively or otherwise.
Yeah, especially with the especially how you said it doesn't feel any different now that your films are much more successful than when you were making them like just for your mum. I just love the handmade quality of your films. I think it's got a lot to do with the fact that they were shot on film, so you hand process them yourself. And I think it was Mark Jenkin said it feels like you can literally see the fingertips on it, that it just feels that homemade. Is there any particular reason you choose to shoot your films like that, particularly Bait in black and white, or just any of your films in film with that very grainy style? Because it's very unique.
Well, I think it just goes back to what I was saying then about my initial love of film was shooting single rolls of Super 8 and doing everything myself, sending off to get it processed, and then it coming back and having this piece of film that I'd captured a latent image on, and suddenly that very same piece of film went through some chemicals and came back and then had pictures that I could project. Simple, and I just thought that was magic, and it's as simple as that. And I think what happened was, as I moved on through my work and things like Mini DV came out, that was a great moment. I think a real punk moment in terms of filmmaking, where these cameras became affordable or at least attainable, and the tapes were pretty cheap, and you could shoot with a certain amount of freedom, and then you could get software to run on a computer that you could edit on. Because again, that was a really recent thing. When I went to university in 95, that was when that kind of editing was first coming in on computers. So it's really not that long ago, and it wasn't until 2001 that I first had a computer that had an early version of Premiere on it, Premiere 5.1 or something, that I edited Golden Burn with. That all of the means of production was, belonged to the individual filmmaker. I think then what happened was equipment got more and more sophisticated and cheaper, and I got to the point where I shot a feature film on a DSLR pretty much single-handedly with a couple of collaborators and a sound recordist. And although I really loved the film, I didn't enjoy the process. I didn't like the image particularly. I was constantly trying to subvert this very digital image that I didn't really relate to. And at that point, I realized I'd lost the passion for it a little bit. I wasn't excited each morning to get up and make films. I was doing other stuff. I was doing a lot more teaching and things like that. And I just tried to work out where the passion had gone, and work out where it, retrace my steps effectively back to where I was passionate about film. And I got back to film, real film, 8mm, 16mm. And I started working on film again, and doing that, and trying to make the films in the same way that I made when I was 16 years old, and just showing them to my mum at home. I started making films like that again, and that's this cycle of short films that I'm still working on now, which are done in exactly the same way that I always did. And I love it. I'm working on one now, and it excites me more than any of the other work that I do, these short little Super 8 films. so a few years ago, when I was making those films and feeling very passionate about that, I was also in development with some bigger feature film projects, and I just thought, actually, I want to have the passion that I've got for these short films. I want to have that whilst I'm making these features. So let's not differentiate. Let's not say, oh, I'm doing these short little films on film and in a experimental way, and then I'm making these feature films in a more conventional way over here. I said, let's do it all together, you know, all the same thing, which started with a film called Bronco's House in 2015, which was the precursor to Bait, which is a 45-minute long film made in the exact same way as Bait, and then led on to Bait. So I was able to make Bait in the same way that I make the short films. I mean, it's, as you know, it's a narrative film. The basis of it is a conventional screenplay, but it was done in very much the same hands-on way, of, you know, shooting on film, me shooting it, post syncing it, hand processing it, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think I've worked out a way of working where that passion that I've got for the hands-on that I've got in my short films has been able to be applied to feature film making, which I think is the thing that's got the film a lot of recognition in you know, the way that it's been made, and a lot of people want to talk to me about that, and I've got used to talking about it now. But when those conversations started, it wasn't a big deal for me because that's how I work now. So it's not an unusual way to work in my world.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the concept of it coming full circle, and it feeling like this could have been something that you would have made when you were much younger. Yeah, it's still at this level and it's still doing so well. So if we've just talked about the visual style, so say like obviously how you shoot your films and things like that, I think you also make it work really well when it's just dialogue. And I'd like to hear some advice on that, because Golden Burn, it is obviously low budget, and for the duration of the film, it's mainly conversations. And my next film is a very dialogue-heavy one. I'm known in the past for just doing not loads of dialogue, but the next one is mainly just dialogue for the whole film. It's about an ex-couple who meet for the last time, and it's just their conversations. And I'm anxious as to whether I can pull it off and make that interesting. Would you have any advice or anything that you found useful when making a dialogue-heavy film?
Well, with Golden Burn, it was easy because I was working with a sound recordist, a good friend of mine, Ben Hood, who's a very good sound recordist, and I shot Golden Burn on the mini DV camera, and he recorded the dialogue. So there was no barrier to recording dialogue. It was a very dialogue heavy script, and then the shoot was even more dialogue heavy, because not only did all of the dialogue in the script get recorded, but also I allowed people to improvise. And you know, I'm in the film as well, so the scenes that I'm in, I never learnt the script because I didn't have time to learn it because I was shooting the other scenes. So my dialogue is all improvised and is all over the place and is really wordy, but it wasn't a problem because I had a great sound recordist. When it came to when I've come to shooting stuff silently, like Bronco's House and Bait, what I do before we start shooting is I cut out every single bit of dialogue that is unnecessary, because I don't want to have to re-record. I don't have to record dialogue in the studio and post-sync loads of stuff unless it's absolutely necessary. So the dialogue in Bait, in my opinion, is the absolute bare bones. I chopped out loads in the final draft of the script. We probably chopped some dialogue whilst shooting, and then in the edit, I chopped even more dialogue out. I would tend to shoot some dialogue scenes so that I can write the dialogue afterwards. So there's a couple of times in Bait where I've shot non-sync scenes, so shot dialogue scenes using close-ups of hands and things like that, so I can tweak the dialogue afterwards. I did that in Bronco's House as well. If you've got a sound recordist and you're recording dialogue, you may never have to think like that, but I don't necessarily think it's a good thing to have complete freedom. So I would look at ways of not just showing people talking. If you've got a lot of dialogue, counterpoint the dialogue with action that's not necessarily in keeping with the dialogue, just to keep it visually interesting, you know, show don't tell, but also give yourself freedom to rewrite dialogue in the edit. Because when those characters that you've written, did you write it?
Yes, I wrote it. I wrote the main draft, and I've had a co-writer just to go over the screenplay with me.
Because if you're writing it, both of those characters are just going to be, no matter whether they're based on real people or imaginary people, they're both going to be effectively incarnations of you.
Yeah,
then you bring the actors in,
true.
and the actors bring in another dynamic, and a dynamic together, but also another. They sort of flesh out the personality of your personality, and then when you look at that footage back in the edit, you'll realize that the characters aren't necessarily the characters that you wrote, and the film will be better for that. But you need to give yourself the freedom to be able to then manipulate those performances. So, yeah, that would be my advice: is to shoot as much dialogue in a visually non-dialogue way. Because you also don't want the pictures just to be wallpaper for dialogue.
Oh, of course. It's all about the locations, especially. But yeah, I found that really useful. What you've just said there, because I watched Bait again last night, and one of the things that struck me this time was how well the cutaway shots are used. As you said, like you've just explained it in more detail. But and especially with the dialogue as well, I feel like not much is said that isn't absolutely necessary. And that you've kind of inspired me to go through my script again and just get rid of all the just useless and make it quite focused. Because that's when the meaning of the film is quite obvious. It's not just people chatting about. No one wants to watch that.
Well, and I chose a film form that forces me to do that. I didn't think, right, I've got to chop out all of the dialogue, you know, just because the film will be better with less dialogue. I did it because the way that I shoot films means I don't want to be recording loads of dialogue. But I think as a result of the limitations that the form puts on the way I work, that makes the films leaner, simpler. You know, using close-ups and cutaways instead of dialogue in the film quite a lot of the time. I do that in the edit because I haven't got enough footage, because I'm shooting on film. I only shoot one take of everything, one take and a safety. I don't shoot any wide shots. I don't shoot any coverage. I just shoot the specific shots that I want to use. And sometimes when I get in the edit, those scenes don't cut together. So then I'm forced to think creatively. So I could claim that that's all in the script, all of this, you know, these cutaways and montage and stuff, but it's not. It's really through the limitations of the way that I work forces me to make these decisions. So in a way, if you're shooting digitally, you have to artificially create those limitations to force you to think creatively in the process. Because the main problem, and there aren't many problems with it, but the main problem of sort of cheap digital equipment is that anything's possible and you can just shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot, which seems like a good thing, but actually is quite often a barrier for creativity, unless the whole point of your thing is that you're going to shoot and shoot and shoot. And then of course, you know, it's ideal, but you do have to create these kind of artificial limitations to kickstart your creativity.
Yeah, that's very true. Shooting on digital, I find that, as you said, I'm tempted to just do 10 takes of things. And I think if I was shooting on film, would I be doing this? And obviously not. Yeah, about bringing yourself those limitations, how specifically do you think that can be done with digital, if you know what I mean?
Well, they have to be arbitrary. So you could, you know, maybe you could be as arbitrary as looking at your script and doing a word count of the dialogue and go, right, I'm gonna remove 50% of the dialogue. Say there's, you know, 1,000 words spoken. Say, right, I'm going to limit myself to 500. Just it doesn't necessarily then, you know, if you did that, that doesn't necessarily have to be your shooting script. Would it be interesting to see what that does? You know.
Yeah, it just
things like having a look at things like, you know, if you've got two characters, swap the dialogue. give him all of her dialogue and give her all of his dialogue, and then look at the script, and suddenly that you'll look at that dialogue in a completely different way, and you might think, oh, actually some of this works better the other way around. But what it might also do is go, actually, once it's coming out of somebody else's mouth, this dialogue isn't important anymore. Can I get rid of it? You know, it might also stimulate you to think, no, this needs more dialogue. It's not necessarily always about taking stuff out. It's just kind of kickstarting that creativity through limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the overusage of dialogue is often a downfall for sort of filmmakers at my level. I feel like people forget that it's show don't tell. So I noticed in Bait a lot of the things that he was saying, it just sounded like how a real conversation flows. So like he mutters something under his breath, see you again, Martin, hope not, and just things like that. I feel like that just flows so much better, because I would be tempted, or anyone my level would be tempted to just write everything that comes to mind, and you forget that this is going to be a visual film. This is going to be something people watch. It's not all just dialogue. So yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think I like dialogue that either says everything on the nose or says nothing. You know, because I think that's what I think as humans, it's kind of how we speak. The middle ground is the difficult bit. You know, we either get ourselves into situations where you have to say what you mean, because there's an urgency to it, a directness to it, or the rest of the time we're mostly chatting and just talking shit and not actually saying anything of any importance.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on from that, just before we finish, I heard you talk to Mark Kermode. I saw the interview with Mark Kermode, and you talk about your next film, which was a horror set in the 1970s. Am I right? If you could either just tell me a little bit about that, or what you're going to be doing in the future, because judging by Bait, I'm really excited to see what comes next for you.
Yeah, well, I've written this horror screenplay, which is fully funded, and we should be we should be just in our third week of shooting at the moment, but we cancelled. Well, we postponed it, pushed it back a year. So this time next year, all being well, touch wood, we'll be shooting. It's called Ennis Men, which in the Cornish language means Stone Island, and it's a film set in 1973 off the coast of Cornwall, on an island where a woman is spending the winter and spring alone as a volunteer for the local wildlife trust, observing a very rare flower that's growing in the contaminated soil around an old tin mine. And she lives in one of the old miners' cottage on the island, which is not inhabited anymore. And the only thing on the island, and the thing that gives the island its name, is a standing stone that's at the highest point of the island, this 9-foot standing stone that she's convinced herself is slowly moving down the hillside towards her house. So it's a horror film. I wanted to write a horror because several people had said to me, and quite a lot of the critical writing about Bait and Bronco's House had mentioned that it at times had a feeling of foreboding that was quite close to horror,
I definitely felt that.
And folk horror. So I thought I'd write a horror screenplay, which I did, and then I read it back and realized there wasn't actually much horror in it, because I think that where the foreboding and the horror in Bronco's House and Bait comes from is from the use of the form rather than the content, which would be in the screenplay. So it's going to be done in the same way as Bait. It's going to be color this time, because it's going to look like it was made in 1973. So we're going to shoot it on color neg on my Bolex camera and post synced. I think there's only about 5 lines of dialogue in the whole screenplay, so it almost works like a silent film. And then after that, I haven't talked about this at all yet, but I'm developing a couple of slightly bigger projects. Ennis Men's roughly the same scale as Bait, and then I'm working on a couple of slightly bigger projects that might involve a bit more collaboration and a bit more development. They're technically a little bit more complicated.
Okay, especially Ennis Men. It sounds absolutely fantastic. I cannot wait to see it. Mark, thank you so much for chatting to me. I hope anyone watching this will be really useful for. If you haven't seen Bait already, go and watch it. Do yourself a favour, you won't regret it. It's on BFI Player, and I believe Golden Burn and some of your older films are still on Vimeo. Is that right?
Yeah, there's quite a lot on Vimeo, and I'm cycling through them and making them available to stream for free for certain times. Some of the shorts might be, it looks like they might be being acquired and will be available to stream full time, but I can't really say any more about that at the moment. But that's hopefully in the next few months before the autumn, a lot of the shorts will be out there and available to stream.
Okay, thank you very much for joining me, Mark. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks for reaching out to me.
Thank you so much for watching. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope you do too. I'll put the link for Streaming Bait in the description, and if you want to watch any of my films, which aren't as good as his, then stick around on the channel and have a look.